Happy Mother's Day. I find it kind of ironic that we've been working our way through the book of Joshua, looking at the Promised Land battles, these battles that the Jewish people fought coming into the land of Canaan when they came into the Promised Land. It's kind of ironic. Here we are on Mother's Day. Nothing says Mother's Day like a really gross, violent battle and 5 kings getting run through with a sword. So yeah, happy Mother's Day. It is a really interesting story though, and I find some applications that I can use in my own life that apply to me in the battles that I face. And I've heard some of you say the same thing, that this series we're doing has been helpful for dealing with some of the struggles, some of the battles that you face on your own. And so I appreciate those comments, and I really appreciate what I'm learning in the book of Joshua. Remember last week, though, we left off with Joshua and the Israelites getting tricked by these Gibeonites. They were supposed to wipe out everyone who was within the land of Canaan, according to the instructions from Moses and directly from the Lord. And these Gibeonites tricked them into thinking they were from far off, which would put them outside of that command of the Lord. They knew what they were doing, and yet Joshua created this treaty, this agreement with them, not to kill them all off, and they survived because of it. Here today in Joshua 10, these 5 kings come up against the Gibeonites, and Joshua comes to their rescue. It's just an interesting twist. Just, I think, months before this event, the Gibeonites themselves were considered enemies of Israel, enemies of God because of their paganism. And here Joshua is coming to the rescue while they're being attacked by these 5 kings. By the way, these are 5 kings, not to be confused with 5 guys. That's a place where you can get greasy hamburgers, really greasy hamburgers. But we're going to talk today about these 5 kings. But almost right away, after the Gibeonites made this treaty with Joshua, these 5 kings are coming up against them, led by the king of Jerusalem, which I find a really interesting part of this story. And like we said, it wasn't that long ago that they were God's enemies, and now they're falling under the protection of the Israelites and of God. And it's kind of ironic that Joshua technically would have had these people as their enemies. These would have been the enemies of the Israelites. But because Joshua made this treaty, he was going to stand by his word. He was going to be a person of honor. Because for followers of God, honor means something. For people who follow the Lord, honor matters. We've talked about this. Our word means something. It has to, for those who are representatives of God. So let's turn to Joshua 10. We're not able this morning to read the whole story, but we're going to read a good chunk of it today. Joshua 10. Now it came about when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he had done to Jericho and its king, so he had done to Ai and its king, and that the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were within their land. Then he feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all the men were mighty. Therefore Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent word to Hoham, king of Hebron, and Piram, king of Jarmuth, and Japhia, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, Come up to me and help me, and let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the sons of Israel. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon gathered together and went up, they with all their armies, and camped by Gibeon and fought against it. Then the men of Gibeon sent word to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal. Remember Joshua after Jericho and after Ai, he went back to Gilgal, which was where they started, and he was camping there. So they sent word to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, "Do not abandon your servants. Come to us quickly and save us and help us, for all the kings of the Amorites that live in the hill country have assembled against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the valiant warriors. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands." That's a point we should remember. God has given them into their hands. Not one of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly by marching all night from Gilgal. And the Lord confounded them before Israel, and he slew them with the great slaughter at Gibeon, and pursued them by the way of ascent to Beth-horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it came about, as they fled from before Israel, while they were at the descent of Beth-horon, that the Lord threw large hailstones from heaven on them, as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died from hailstones than those who died by the sons of Israel killed by the sword. Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the sons of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon, and O moon in the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jashar? And the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. And there was no day like that before or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Another point to remember. The Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to the camp at Gilgal. Then it goes on to tell about how Joshua fought right there in the city of Makkedah. Now these 5 kings had fled and hidden themselves in the cave at Makkedah. And it was told Joshua, saying, "The 5 kings have been found hidden in the cave at Makkedah." This is like an insert in the story. And Joshua said, "Roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and assign men to guard them. But do not stay there for yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack them in the rear." I have to stop there. It says there, attack them in the rear. I had to look this up because I thought that sounded unusual to my American ears. So I checked the Amplified version of the Bible. The Amplified version of the Bible wasn't much more help. It said, "Pursue your enemies and fall upon their rear." So I thought, well, maybe I better check the King James Version. The King James Version wasn't much help either. It said, "Pursue after your enemies and smite the hindmost of them." So I prefer the NIV, which says, "Pursue your enemies and attack them from the rear." It's talking about going behind the ranks of the armies and attacking them before they can back their way back into their cities. It's a military exercise that's happening there. Do not allow them, I'm in 19, verse 19. Do not allow them to enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hand. And it came about when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished slaying them with a very great slaughter until they were destroyed, and the survivors who remained of them had entered the fortified cities, that all the people returned to the camp to Joshua at Makkedah in peace. No one uttered a word against any of the sons of Israel. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring these 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so, and brought the 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And it came about, when they brought these kings out to Joshua, that Joshua called for all the men of Israel, and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." This is sort of a cultural thing that would happen in times of war, that the victor would put their foot on the neck of the captured enemies. So they came near and put their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, "Do not fear or be dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies with whom you fight." I was thinking about, teaching children. When I used to teach children, you always try to come up with an object lesson. This is a really good object lesson for the leaders. Joshua wants these chiefs of the armies to understand that the Lord was going before them and was going to give them victory. So afterward, Joshua struck them and put them to death. And he hanged them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. And it came about at sunset that Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the tree and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and put large stones over the mouth of the cave to this very day. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day. So Joshua finishes this business with the 5 kings, and then he goes right into the city, which was right there, Makkedah, and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And then it goes on for the remainder of the chapter, which we don't have time to read all of it, but gives the list of 8 cities that Joshua captured following this attack on the 5 kings and the city of Makkedah. It was a great victory. Remember that this is in the context of the fact that Joshua was warned, the people were warned that when they came into the promised land that they would find armies greater and stronger than they were. And so it required the help of the Lord. This was an amazing, from a military perspective, an amazing set of battles that Joshua undertook here and won, even though any one of those armies would have been larger than the army of Israel. And the point is that it was the Lord's victory. I just want to point out a couple of, I think, really interesting things about this passage. Maybe you kind of clicked in your mind as you heard this, but it's interesting that the leader of these 5 cities, the 5 kings, the leader was the king of Jerusalem. And so I was thinking about this week, how unusual it is that Joshua was coming up against the king of Jerusalem, who at that time was practicing paganism, child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and he is at the center, this king of Jerusalem is at the center of this story. We know Jerusalem as the city of David. We know Jerusalem as the place where the long line of kings followed after David. The ladies' Bible study was studying these kings. All of that took place in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the church began on the day of Pentecost. Jerusalem is the place where the temple was located and where sacrifices for sins were given. Jerusalem was the place where Christ had so many conflicts with the religious leaders. But here, 1,400 years earlier, we see the name Jerusalem as being mentioned as an enemy of the Lord's army. That kind of struck me. What kind of meaning do we place on that? What does that mean? Remember that Jerusalem, the longer history was that when Abraham left Ur, when God told Abraham to pick up and move and gave him the promise of land and people as great as the stars in the sky. Abraham left, and at one point he stopped in this region, didn't stay there, but moved on. And while he was there, was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac on the altar. Remember that story? And that happened on Mount Moriah, which now, tradition holds, is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And I was asking myself this week, what meaning do we place on that? That what started out as a place of blessing ended up being sort of the capital city for paganism in Canaan. And then the Lord allowed the Israelites to take it over. I find this fascinating and it's very interesting. The fact that Abraham had sacrificed Isaac on that very location, and now God is redeeming that spot and placing a new capital right there in Jerusalem. It's kind of like the place of testing often becomes the place of blessing. And I think what I see here is God placing the center, the capital of his work. It's really a picture of redemption. He's placing it right there in the heart of rebellion against God, which is really what the Canaanites had been practicing. God was implanting redemption into the center of man's rebellion against him. Do you suppose that Satan knew that something special was going to become of this location? And maybe he tried to thwart God's plan, as we've seen Satan attempt to do in the past at other times? Maybe he said, I'll get God. We'll put this false religion right in the heart, right in the center of where God's work is supposed to take place. I think Satan's a pretty smart individual. I think he knew what he was doing. And yet what was supposed to be an affront to God, God redeemed and placed his blessing coming from that very place. And all of the world finds a blessing because of the sacrifice of Christ, which we just celebrated that. All the world finds a blessing in what happened on that spot. Well, one other thing I wanted to mention in here, another unusual thing, is that the Anakim are mentioned in this passage. The Anakim were the giants in the land. Remember when the spies were sent into the land, and they came back and said, there are giants in the land. It's talking about the Anakim. I believe it's probably the same heritage as Goliath that David fought against, the giant. There's a lot of evidence that that genetic line lived on throughout much of the Old Testament, and you see these giants appear now and then in Old Testament history. I believe that's what we're seeing here. They too were wiped out when the Israelites came into Canaan. Just a couple of interesting facts before we get into the real study here. I want to look this morning at this passage, though, and kind of cull out some advice for fighting our own battles. What can we learn from these battles that the Israelites fought that will help us in our own situations? The first thing I see here is that wise warriors will be people of honor even in the battles. We're called to be people of honor. It's part of our nature as believers in Christ to be people of honor. We see Joshua here honoring the treaty that he had made with the Gibeonites. I wonder if Joshua ever had second thoughts about that. I just don't really feel like honoring that treaty today. It's not really in Israel's best interest. I wish I wouldn't have made that promise. I feel differently today. No, because he was working for the Lord, he had to be a person of honor. And he honored that treaty, even though it put his nation in sort of a difficult spot. Verse 7 says, so Joshua went up. When he heard about this business with the 5 kings and the Gibeonites, he just went up. and went to fight for the Gibeonites. You know, it might be tempting for us in the middle of a battle to give ourselves a pass and to throw standards out and just say, well, now I have permission to not be honorable because, you know, I was wronged or this is a bad situation. No, we're called to be people of honor all the time, even when situations are difficult, perhaps especially when we're in the battle. Wise warriors will be people of honor even in the battle. Scripture says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Matthew 5:37. You know, trust is everything for the believer. So much of what we preach, what we stand on, has to do with trust and truth. And we need to be people that honor truth and are people of trust. I wrote a book. The second book I wrote was called The Cardinal Element. It's all about the relationship between trust and the church and how important trust is in the church. It's everything for you and I. We are people of trust. We are called to be people of trust, to be people who stand on truth. You think about all the truths in Scripture that sort of build one off of another. They're all a series of truths. The gospel itself is built on truth. And if we don't live lives based on truth and trust, our message really is meaningless. So trust is really important. It's like the H in H2O. Without the H, what do you have? You have air. Sometimes maybe some hot air. You know, I think about child's play, you know, when we were kids. A friend would come up to you and say, hey, I'll give you a piece of candy if you let me ride your bike. And you say, sure. And I had my fingers crossed, so I'm off the hook here. And sometimes as adults, we have that same temptation to kind of play with honor and play with truth. God calls us to be people of honor, even in the battles. Well, secondly, I learned from this passage that we need to know that God is by our side, even in the battles. And we see that all the way through this story. I think it's like 9 times in this story it says that the Lord will fight for you, or the Lord has given the battle into your hands. The Israelites could not have done this without the Lord's help. I read one article about some of the city-states that the Israelites went in and conquered. It was saying that any one of those battles, in any one of those battles, the Israelites were outnumbered like 10-1. These armies really were larger armies, and they could have only done this by the Lord's help. And we even see that through history. How many times have nations tried to wipe Israel off the map? And they're still there. They're still surviving. And we see these promises in Scripture still being fulfilled today. God was by their side, and God would be by our side in a battle, in our battles. I wrote down the words, we're in a partnership, and I hesitate to use that word partnership because it's really like we're not really bringing anything to the table in our battles when we're talking about our partnership with God. Really, it's Him. And it's the example we see here in this story. The Israelites were nothing without God. So even the word partnership kind of falls flat to describe what was happening here. It's really more of a dependence on the Lord's strength. Still, the Israelites were to be involved in the battle. Verse 19 says, fight hard, for the Lord has given them into your hand. I asked myself the question, if the Lord's given them the battle, why not just sit back and watch? Why be involved in the battle? Wouldn't it be much easier just to sit back and let the Lord do the work? I think it would. and thinking about our own battles. If the Lord knows the end, and if the Lord is in control, why not just sit back and let it happen? That's not the way it works, though. God calls us to be involved and to take action. And as believers, we're to be fully involved in the battle. We're to be fully engaged. This isn't a sit back and watch kind of arrangement. This is one of the things we talked about here at One Hope Community Church, that this is an all hands on deck situation here. And it takes all of us participating in God's work to see His church grow and flourish. Well, like I mentioned, 9 times in this passage, it says that the Lord gave them the victory, or that the Lord fought for them. But He never once said, just sit back and watch. He always called the Israelites to be involved, to have a part in it. And notice that the Lord's promise of victory isn't like a bare bones kind of, like you're barely going to make it, but you'll get through and you'll have victory. It's for full-on victory. We see this in several passages in Joshua. Over in Joshua 1:5, it says, "No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you." In other places in the book of Joshua, it tells how the Lord would give complete victory for the Israelites. So wise warriors will be people of honor even in the battle. And good warriors will know that God is by our side. And finally, courage is necessary for the battle. And we should take courage as we battle in our own struggles. In verse 25, the Lord gives the command through Joshua, be strong and courageous. This is one of the key themes all the way through the book of Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Take courage. We know this promise from Joshua 1:6-9. We'll just take a quick look at that. This is actually what I think is the key verse for Joshua. Joshua 1:6-9. Be strong and courageous, for you shall give this people possession of the land which I swore to the fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do according to all the law which Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, so that you may have success wherever you go. This is the promise right from the beginning of the story of Joshua and the entrance into the promised land, for the Israelites to be strong. And these promised land battles, all of them, if good Jews were looking backwards, they would realize that these were a fulfillment of the promise of Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy 20:1-4, these are the instructions about the battles. This is before they came into the promised land. And they're getting this instruction about what they're going to encounter. They don't know what they're in for. They don't know what they're going to find in there. Only these brief mentions of what is going to happen. Deuteronomy 20:1-4 says, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. Now it shall come about that when you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. And he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemy today. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid, or panic, or tremble before them. And here's the promise. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and save you. I think God goes to great lengths to help the Israelites see that it's not really about them, that it's not really their strength that's winning these battles, that it really all comes from following the instructions of the Lord and depending on Him and trusting that He's going to give them victory. You know, we live under the same promises for God to be with us in our own struggles. The Lord said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He's with us in these struggles where we need strength that only comes from Him. Colossians 2:15 says, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, He made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Because of the cross, we can have great confidence. There's great victory. The battle's really already been won. It's only left for us to finish fighting for the Lord. Romans 8:38 and 39. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any power, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ our Lord. That's a great promise, that God will always be with us, always protect us, no matter what we're going through. Courage is necessary, but we can expect God to be involved in our battles. Now I want you to notice the two miracles, these two miraculous events that happened in this passage. In verse 11, we see the hailstones. This is a miraculous thing. There's sort of a situation in this battle when they started fighting, and then as the opposing armies were retreating, they were kind of going down a slope. And as they're going down this slope and the Israelites coming after them, these hailstones are falling on them. And the passage says that more men were killed by hailstones than by the sword. And this kind of gives us a glimpse into how it is that with such great odds against the Israelites, how it is that they were able to remain in power and to win so many battles. It's because the Lord was fighting with them, sometimes in very miraculous ways. And then there's this interesting little bit about the sun and the moon standing still. You know, when you first read that, it almost sounds like Joshua's commanding the sun and moon to stand still. That's not really what's happening here. He's asking the Lord for the sun and the moon to stand still because he recognizes he wants complete victory. But he knows that if nightfall comes and these armies end up getting into their cities, then they're going to be locked in where it's very difficult to come up against them and to find victory against people inside of a walled city. And so he asked the Lord to make the sun and moon stand still. And then there's this business here about, isn't it written in the book of Jashar? Well, what's that book? We don't know. It doesn't exist. If you're in secondhand books one day and you see a copy of the book of Jashar, make sure you purchase that book because it's probably one of a kind. But this little part, you'll notice in verse 12 and 13, there's sort of like an inset area, a space in there where it looks like something was inserted or like it's a poem or a song or something. It's indented. The reason it's indented is that's actually a quote. Scholars believe that's a quote from the book of Jashar, where it was telling about the victory and about the specifics of the sun and the moon standing still. And so Joshua asked for the sun to stand still, and the witnesses say that it lasted that way for like a full day. They had a full day to continue on in the battle. And the summary's there in verse 13. There never was a day like it before or after when the Lord listened to the voice of a man. Now we know God listens to our prayers. We know He hears our prayers. So what's so unusual about this? They're just saying this is a really unusual situation that Joshua was asking the Lord for a very specific miracle, and the Lord did it. And because of that, they found victory. I read several explanations this week. You know, anytime you run across something like this, you always find people trying to explain it away or to come up with some reason. You know, maybe they just, because of the heat of the battle, weren't paying attention, and it just, you know, seemed like time passed and more quickly or something. But all these explanations, and every one of them fell flat. And I was thinking about that. We do that even when we see God working in our own life. We sort of explain it away and say, well, maybe that wasn't God. And I think it's really important to make mention of the things that we see God doing. It's why we took a full Sunday a couple months back and just talked about all the things that we saw God doing in the planting of One Hope Community Church. Sometimes we don't pay enough attention to the unusual things God does in bringing us along in His plan. And these miracles were reminders for Israel that they weren't winning the battle on their own. I think those miracles were as much for Israel as they were for the victory in the battle. So that Israel could see that it was definitely the Lord who was going before them and fighting for them. One other thing I wanted to mention about this passage, and I didn't make it a full point, so this is like your bonus sermon point here this morning. It's one other thing I think we learn from this passage. Has to do with those 5 kings hiding in the cave. And this is what I want to say. There really is no hiding from God. We all know that. I believe there really is a God. And if He really is sovereign, which we believe, omniscient, which we believe, He's all-knowing, we can't hide from Him. No one can hide from the Lord. And just like in this story, eventually the Bible tells us that every knee will bow, either by choice or by force. It's in the end of the book, and we read about that. So why hide from God? Cowards hide. Remember Osama bin Laden? When he was found, what was he doing? He was hiding behind one of his wives, they tell us. How about Saddam Hussein? When they finally found him, remember? He was hiding in a hole. These pictures of these great men, I mean great in a bad way, feared leaders, hiding. That's the situation here in Joshua. I've been thinking about this. There's really more than one way to hide. We can hide physically. We learn that as small children playing hide and go seek. I love it when my grandson, wants to hide. His legs are sticking out from under the bed or something. Some are better at hiding than others. But there are other ways to hide. We can hide behind other people. We can hide behind words. You can hide behind the truth. Sometimes cowards will say, well, that's not really what I meant. Or if I said that, I didn't really mean that. Well, yeah, but you said it. Or you're twisting my words. Sometimes our words give us away and we like to hide behind them. And it's really interesting how these kings met their end. We mentioned this earlier. Joshua brings them out of the cave and has the soldiers, the chiefs, put their feet on the neck, and then Joshua makes an example of them and finishes them off, and then they bury them in the cave and pile rocks over the entrance of the cave. It seemed like Joshua really liked to pile rocks on people. Remember, he did it at Ai with the king. He put the king at the gate. There was nobody in the city. The city's gone, destroyed. But he puts the king at the gate and makes a pile of rocks over him. So anybody that comes along says, oh yeah, that's where God brought victory for Joshua, and here's where the king is piled up under rocks. And remember, he did it to Achan and his family too. After they were killed and then burned for their sin, made a pile of rocks. Joshua used those rocks often to make an example. I've often wondered, like if you went around Israel long enough, you'd probably find a pile of rocks over there somewhere, several maybe. One way or another, though, Scripture tells us that every knee will bow, by choice or by force. And we have to take note here, too, in this story, that victory was complete. I did the the research on this week. The area that Joshua conquered in the battles going right up to verse 28, not even including the other cities, the area that he took over all the way up through the Battle of Makeda was like 40 square miles. Like if you went from downtown Oklahoma City to El Reno, up to Kingfisher, and over to Guthrie, it would be like that square of an area. And in just a few days, Joshua went in and had victory over that much property. There was, and just to kind of give you a context, Joshua and the people didn't go right away into the cities and inhabit the cities. They went back to Gilgal at their camp. They hadn't become numerous enough yet to spread the people out and occupy the cities that they had conquered. This shows you that God was giving them victory well in advance of the need for space that they were going to have in the Promised Land. These are incredible odds that Israel went up against, but because of the Lord's strength, they were victorious. Because they trusted in the Lord, they found victory. And I can't help but make mention of the fact that in context of last week coming into this week, last week Joshua got tricked into this treaty that he really should have never made in the first place. And you would think that would hamstring him from accomplishing God's will, but God went ahead and gave them victory anyway, even though Joshua's decision made it more difficult for them from a military perspective, because now they have these Gibeonites they have to defend. But in the defense of the Gibeonites, they ended up accomplishing God's will, which God set out from the beginning. It's an interesting commentary on how sometimes God works in our lives and brings about victory, even though we're not always 100% obedient and we don't always follow his instructions. Well, what do we take away from today's message? There's some great lessons here. I've really been enjoying this. We're going to take a week off next week and honor graduates, and then we'll come back for one last series of battles in Joshua the week after that. But just in wrapping it up today, I just want to say this. For whatever battles you're facing, and we know that we all face battles sometimes, but for whatever battles you're facing, know that wise warriors will be people of honor even in the battle. And know that God is by our side in our battles. And remember that courage is necessary for every battle.